Good afternoon. Well, all the buttons are in the right place, and so the blue screen will surely give way soon to a screen showing the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is where we left off last time. Perhaps it will help if I turn off the lights. Okay. What I hope to do today is to finish the lecture from that we started on Wednesday about World War II. Recall the story of how the fortunes of Asian Americans changed rather dramatically as a result of World War II, and the final act is the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Which I'm dying to talk about, and I'm unable to because it's so hard to talk without this screen. But, oh well, it may come to that. Okay. All right. Okay, I think it's probably hopeless. So you can close your eyes. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in May of 1943. Or I should say the Citizens Committee to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act and place immigration on quota basis was formed in May of 1943. That's an organization with a very carefully selected name, right? It's not exactly short, doesn't roll off the tongue. The Citizens Committee to repeal Chinese exclusion and place immigration on a quota basis, right? So it's very upholding of the 1924 Quotas Act, right? To place immigration on a quota basis. The group is really successful. They managed the campaign and they stressed the propaganda value against the Japanese. Okay, like many, just like the Emancipation Proclamation, this fundamentally freedom-enhancing act had to be sold as a war measure. And at the time, the Japanese were promoting something called the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, in which much of their propaganda was that Asia should be for Asians. That was their slogan. And what they were saying was that Europeans and Americans couldn't be trusted to promote the welfare of Asians. Much of Asia at this time was under colonial rule. In the case of China, for example, well, in the case of all Asian countries, a serious propaganda problem for the United States was that the United States prohibited immigration from all Asian countries. Right? In the 1917 Asian Barred Zone simply prohibited immigration, so it was hard to say that America had Asians' best interests at heart. We weren't willing to let them immigrate. So propaganda value was one of the key points that can be raised, that the lobbyists raised against the Chinese Exclusion Act. The importance of bolstering an ally's morale was another piece of it. Remember those posters showing the Chinese are our friends? Well, you're going to be somebody's friend. You can't have these exclusionary acts. They also stressed that the quota, which the act would grant to China, was tiny. It would be 105. That's a small number, and it's hard to imagine where they came up with that number. Remember the quota for the Philippines, the Tidings-McDuffie Act, was going to be 50. Another small number. But apparently the Chinese are about 51% more our allies or something. I don't know what to read into the number 105, except that it's very small. And in addition to this argument that, the quota will be small, they also argue that it might help the Chinese authorities to keep illegal immigrants from coming. So the argument essentially was that by granting the right to immigrate, you might actually have fewer immigrants. So it was a very slick sort of campaign. And within 7 months, in December of 1943, the act is repealed. It repealed all or part of 15 statutes enacted since 1882. And that's an impressive accomplishment because it undid what had seemed to be pretty much a bedrock of American immigration policy. Remember that 1882 and since 1882 we were continuously happy to continue to prohibit Chinese exclusion. The people who argued against it, yes? Yes. Right. After repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese would be granted a quota of 105. Remember, at this point, the 1924 Act is in place, and all the countries, except for the Asian Barred Zone, have quotas, which are based on the census plus a whole lot of voodoo done by Joseph Hill. Recall, but there were no quotas granted to Asian countries, so this would grant them quota. And the idea was again to place immigration on a quota basis. Right? So that makes it largely right in the realm of symbol. Right, 105 is a small number. Nonetheless, the restrictionists at this time, the people who argued against this, argued that this was a thin edge of the wedge. That this was really an assault on the quota system and on our restrictive immigration policies, and we should worry about it. They turned out to be right, and I think that's of some interest because you recall that 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, was kind of the first act to limit immigration on the basis of nationality. It was the hinge, as Roger Daniels put it, it's the hinge on which the door of exclusion closed. Right. So now in 1943, it's going to turn out, as we will see the rest of the 20th century unfold, this is the beginning of the end too. The Chinese exclusion, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act is going to ultimately, it is the first of a series of acts that finally in 1965 will undo restrictions by nationality. One of the reasons that this act was more powerful than the quota of 105 would seem is because of Section 3. And it reads as follows. Section 303 of the Nationality Act of 1940 as amended, 54 Stat 1140 A8 USC 703 is hereby amended by striking out the word and before the word descendants, changing the colon after the word hemisphere to a comma, and adding the following, and Chinese persons or persons of Chinese descent. Now, since you've all memorized the Nationalities Act of 1940, which is really the Nationalities Act of 1870, it hasn't changed, you'll realize instantly that what that means is that Chinese people can naturalize as citizens. So the real power of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act was not the 105 quota. It was the change in the Naturalization Act. Remember, which had in 1790 said free and white, in 1873 white and of African descent. Now it says African, comma, or Chinese persons or persons of Chinese descent. Right. So that was both symbolic and real importance to many Chinese Americans, and that of course is why this is a thin edge of a wedge. Once you add Chinese to this list, you have a list that includes white, African descent, and Chinese or Chinese descent, and it's pretty clear that there's instantly pressure to ask, well, why not other groups? Anyway, and that, of course, is the story that happens quite quickly. If you could see this slide, it's titled After Repeal of the CEA. And after the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we have bills to allow wives of Chinese Americans to immigrate. Let's see, I'm still experimenting, still hoping that this thing will wake up. There are bills to allow wives of Chinese Americans to immigrate. Those are defeated. But in 1945, the War Brides Act is passed, which specifically includes Asians. So soldiers' wives and fiancés are permitted to migrate. In 1946, the Luce Seller Act adds quotas and naturalization rights to persons of races indigenous to India and the Philippine Islands. Right? So Indians and Filipinos. Again, these are, so once you start with Chinese, then what happens is all of the allies in World War II are granted these permissions. And along with the rights to immigrate under these very small quotas come the rights to naturalize. So in conclusion, World War II caused remarkably sudden changes to racial attitudes towards Asians. By the end of the war, this change is really mimics the politics of the war itself. That is, that we love our allies and nationals of people of countries that are allied with the U.S., the Philippines, India, China. Those people are granted citizenship. The Japanese are still not granted citizenship. So it's not, the World War does not bring on a sudden realization, some new appreciation of the insignificance of race. It simply adds to the list of races that we like, certain Asian races that were not on that list before World War II. Yes? I'm sorry, what's the question? Right. It's the countries that are allied with the U.S. who gain favor from World War II. I'm saying that the effect of the war was to add to the list of races, quote, or countries that we liked. And the most surprising ones were Indians, Chinese, and Filipinos. These are groups that, as we've seen, have not been on that list before. As far as immigration law is concerned, Congress has been bending over backwards to try to exclude them in various ways just years or decades before. But World War II changes that, at least for the countries that are allied. But what I'm saying is that it wasn't that the war caused a sudden realization that race doesn't matter, and thus racial bars of all sorts came down. It was the racial bars that were reflected in the politics of the time. Chinese were our allies, therefore they were allowed to immigrate and allowed to naturalize. Same with the Filipinos, same with the Indians. Not so with the Japanese. It will still take another decade for the Japanese to gain this favor, and that will come about as a result of the Cold War, when we'll see the Japanese are on our side. But that will wait until next week. Any questions, final observations about this World War II period? Yes? The story with the Filipinos was really told last time with the Tydings-McDuffie Act, and it was more of a reaction to, remember the Philippines are a territory of the United States, so they're in a different category. They are allowed to migrate but not to become citizens, but during the war they're allowed to enlist, and as a result of enlistment they will become citizens. That's all worked out during the war. In July of 1946, however, the quotas and naturalization rights are extended to persons of races indigenous to India and the Philippines, so the right to naturalize is then extended. I don't think the Philippine quota was changed, but it may have been at that time too. I'm not sure. In any case, it was not set to more than 100. Right? So these were not acts that said, come and migrate. The welcome mat wasn't exactly out. But in some sense, there were European countries with very small quotas too. So if you kind of held your mouth a certain way, you could see it as equal treatment. It wasn't, except in terms of naturalization, and that's really the dramatic change, is that the naturalization laws are finally coming apart. These are barriers that we've seen have stood in the way of naturalization since 1790. So it is indeed a big deal. Other thoughts or ideas you want to bring up? Okay, then we'll turn then to the invisible slides of that I want to talk to you about the. Let's see. Let's give it a chance. Let's hope. Okay. Anybody? Anything gonna happen? Nothing. Okay. The projector is still broken. Okay. Let's turn then with these 20th century means to ethnic capital and the integration and intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. Right? This is roughly speaking the topic of the fourth lab. Recall that the fourth lab is about Hispanic Mexican American families in the 21st century, and it deals kind of with the question of why. Well, I don't know if we can go so far as to say why, but it deals with the observation that rates of unwed motherhood among Mexican immigrants are very low. This is a part of the stereotype of most Latino immigrants, that there's great reverence for the family, great reverence for marriage, and it bears statistical scrutiny. This is indeed the case that that there are relatively few births to unwed immigrant Mexican women or Latino women in general. But this trend is not observed in second-generation Mexican American women. That is, women who report to the Census Bureau that they are Mexican, but also report they were born in the U.S. So this can cover the children of Mexican immigrants, as well as the grandchildren of Mexican immigrants, as well as Lithuanians who simply check that box for whatever reason. But presumably these are second, third, and subsequent generations of Mexican immigrants. And you have data that shows the likelihood that children of these women live in households where the father is present. Okay, so it's not exactly the same issue as having children outside of marriage, but it's a similar enough issue, and probably clearly a more important one. All right. There are four topics that I want to discuss today that have a bearing on this topic, although these are not exactly straw men for you to knock down. They're not mutually exclusive. They're concepts that are used to discuss this sort of issue, this issue of what's happening with the second generation. So they will be useful to you in thinking about coming up with a thesis, but you don't need to necessarily refer to one of these phrases. You can simply use them when you're having erudite discussions at co-op parties, if you want. The first topic is declining immigrant quality, and there are lots of quotes. If we can see the slide, you see there are quotes around lots of these things. And this is an argument that George Borjas makes, and we're going to go over that shortly. It's the idea that cross-sectional comparisons, that when we see cross-sectional comparisons that show, as they frequently do, that the children of immigrants do very well relative to immigrants and relative to third generation, they can be very misleading because in a cross-section, when you compare second generation with first generation, you're not comparing parents to children. You're comparing people who are roughly the same age. And so if you correct that, as Borjas does in a slide that you won't see, there's an argument that he makes, at least, that some of these effects could be explained by a decreasing quality, declining quality for purposes of labor market. Everything that Borjas talks about is in terms of labor market. That these effects could be the cause of these observations. All right. Then a second topic is regression to the mean. This is do you have a question? Okay. Yeah. The declining immigrant quality debate only refers to labor market characteristics. This is not quality in the sense of net human worth. And I think it's an unfortunate term, but this is the term that sort of sticks in the literature. It's called declining immigrant quality debate. And the whole point of this is, for our purposes, is whether cross-sectional information such as we have can be misleading because you're not necessarily, when we look at first-generation Mexican-American women in our data and compare them to second-generation Mexican-American, we are not looking at parents and children. We're looking at people who are the same age, right? So this is why it matters, and I hope to make it clearer shortly. Regression to the mean is a more general statistical concept, but it also has to do with the idea that if immigrants are exceptional, their children will be generally less exceptional. So if the immigrants are poor, their children are likely to be less poor. If immigrants are well off in some way, their children are likely to be less well off. It's an important general concept, and it also comes into play in this question of what to expect, what will happen, what is happening to the children of immigrants. The third idea, the one that's closest, I think, to this lab, is ethnic capital. And this is why I asked you to read that Borjas paper very, very casually, because it's really only the piece on ethnic capital that I think is relevant to the lab. And ethnic capital is this concept that I don't think Borjas takes credit for. He claims, I think he coined the term, I'm not certain. But ethnic capital is the idea that children of immigrants are influenced by their neighborhoods, by ethnic enclaves, by the values of people around them. It's not too controversial, but it has some interesting problems and some interesting implications for this story. In the data you have, you're looking at metropolitan areas, which for our purposes we're going to call neighborhoods, for the purpose at least of ethnic capital. So the question then is, what can you tell, can you predict anything about this imbalance between the likelihood of children of Mexican immigrants and children of second-generation immigrants to have to be raised in families with a father present? So what can be told, what can you tell about that based on characteristics of the neighborhood, right? Or in this case, the metropolitan area. And so and that also figures with the story, with the fourth idea that I want to talk about today, which is called segmented assimilation. Now, this is one that's at least referred to in the New York Times article we talked about. This is an idea that immigrant children assimilate, and many of them will assimilate upward. That is, they will take advantage of opportunities and education and become part of the mainstream, no problem. But others may assimilate instead towards the underclass. Again, another word that has to be in quotes. Whenever we're talking about sociological terms, we have to put quotes around things because they're not very easy to define. But it's the notion simply that particularly if you're a so-called visible minority, and you land in it's the story that was talked about in Langley Park in the New York Times article, right? These are the children of immigrants, and the communities in which they live are dominated by the culture of a black underclass, if you will. And this whole article is about how these qualities, these values are adopted by the children of immigrants. And as a result, their life, of course, is ruled more by this so-called oppositional culture. Again, quotes, oppositional culture. Okay, so 4 ideas: declining immigrant quality, regression to the mean, ethnic capital, and segmented assimilation. All these ideas are related. There's no mutual exclusivity here. There's no need to say, oh, this one works and that one doesn't. These are just the categories that sociologists tend to use when talking about these questions about whether about the mechanisms by which advantages or disadvantages are transmitted across generations. All right. So a quote that you would see here from George Borjas from the article you read: "The very large ethnic difference in economic status among today's immigrants will likely dominate American society and discussions of American social policy for much of the 21st century." That, you'll notice, is certainly the theme of Borjas' paper, but it's also relevant to us because we're talking now about, in our lab, we're really talking about children who are 2 years old. So they will be grown-ups in the 21st century. All right, this is going to be tricky. This is a slide that you're not seeing right now is from the Borjas article, which you probably don't have either. It's table 1. If you happen to have that with you, or if you have a laptop and you're online, you can go to the website and bring that up. If there are enough that you can look on, that would actually be very helpful. So you go to the course website and open up the Borjas paper, because there's several. I want to show several slides from Borjas paper, and so you can look at them, and we'll have all kinds of fun here. This is a table. What you're not looking at right now is a table, and it's labeled wage differentials across generations, and it shows a bunch of small numbers, which are the age-adjusted wage differential and wage advantage, if you want, or disadvantage, of the first generation relative to the third generation and the second generation relative to the third generation. And there are 3 columns. One is labeled 1940, one 1970, and one 2000. Right? And so what we see here are numbers. Well, let's see, for 1970, they're numbers like 0.014, which translates to 1.4%, and that's the wage advantage of the first generation over the third generation. So Borjas is saying here that in 1970, if you look cross-sectionally, you would find that immigrants, if we adjust for age, that the second generation, that is the children of immigrants, have 14% higher wages than third generation, than their children, and that immigrants have about 1%, 1.5% higher wages than their grandchildren. But I'm using these children and grandchildren incorrectly because we're talking about a cross-section. So we're really talking about people the same age, right? But the difference between people in 1970 who immigrate, people whose parents immigrated, and they immigrated in maybe 1940, versus people whose grandparents immigrated, maybe in 1910, right? That you look at those people, which you can look at in the 1970 census because they ask where your parents were born, you find an advantage that the second generation is doing much better than all the other generations. And Borjas' problem with that is exactly what I said, that you're not actually comparing parents to children. So we're not really looking at intergenerational transmission of advantage or disadvantage. It's not that those people who are second generation in 1970 are not the children of people who are first generation in 1970. They're the children of people who are first generation in 1940. Right? And what Borjas is claiming is that relative to third generation workers in 1940, that first generation in 1940 is better prepared. They're having a better time than the first generation in 1970. Right? And if you look across the table,